Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is week 5 of FDLS 130. I'm really excited to be here. We've got quite a bit of stuff to talk about today and some different ideas. The sort of pro and con of a course like this is that we can always fill up a sorry, I'm hearing Alexa in the background there. So the advantage of a class like this is we can fill up an hour really easily, but the disadvantage of a class like this is that we can fill up an hour really easily. Do you all hear that in the background? Okay, good. It's the Alexa thing keeps talking down here and I'm not sure what's going on. So I hope it doesn't hear me talking too much. Apologies for the distraction there. So let's go ahead and I'm going to share my screen here and kind of give everybody a picture of what we're looking at today. I should probably just present this as a slideshow, but I think that takes up the whole screen. So I'm not going to do it that way. You can kind of get a sense of where we're going anyway. So our agenda for today is first we want to talk about some housekeeping stuff, and we're going to have a pretty good conversation here. I actually have some ideas that I think would be really useful for everybody for a couple of the different running themes that I've been seeing in the reflections and in the discussion boards. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the weekly writing exercises. Those are one where I've been trying to get the feedback to you all finished up by the end of the weekend, but those have been a little bit slow. So just want to give you all some ideas of the general themes again that I think would really help everybody as they're making their way through those weekly writing exercises. We want to follow up on some of the discussion from this week when we've been doing those ed puzzles, talk about paper titles, and it's really a little more complex than I think we often recognize early in our college career. But those titles can be absolutely beneficial to us as we're working through how to step our writing up to the next level, kind of level up. And then want to talk about quote integration and source engagement. And this is one of the more rewarding and difficult skills that we can have as a college writer. So we're going to talk a little bit about the ways that we can bring in quotes and engage with sources on the next level. This is going to be this could be its own course. So this is going to be sort of a quick discussion of how to bring in quotes, how to bring in sources, and what you can do with those sources in your paper. And then, of course, we're going to have some closing thoughts and final questions. If Dimitri or Ariana have some questions they'd like to ask for the good of the order, and if not, I'll just pretend to have questions and ask them on your behalf as well. Everybody good with that? Any questions before we move on to the next step? Okay, let's talk a little bit about housekeeping here. And the housekeeping theme for today is we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of procrastination. So I saw a lot of people in the discussion boards and a lot of people in their reflections talking a lot about procrastination or time management. Those are two sort of running themes. And I think that's great, especially because in my experience as a college instructor, what I found is that your intelligence level has absolutely, I don't want to say nothing to do with your success here, but it has a lot less to do with your success here than your ability to manage time. And so the way to think about it is that if you're here at Mercer, you've been accepted on the premise that you are intellectually capable of passing. So there's no question you're smart enough just by merit of the fact that you made it through the door. So now the question is, how do we decide those techniques that help people to be successful? How do we make sure that we're in a position to be really successful in college? And time management, in my mind, is the absolute number one best thing you can do, is to find some ways to manage time. But before we dive into that, I want to pause for a minute and talk about something that procrastination is not. And this is a matter of sort of giving yourself some credit and giving yourself some grace. So there have been a number of people in the discussion boards and elsewhere, and what they will say is, I've got these 15 different priorities, and often in the course of those priorities, I procrastinate and put off my classwork till the end. That's not really procrastination. That means you're really busy and that life is really difficult and stressful, and it's about prioritization. So it doesn't mean that you're sort of morally flawed and that you're lazy and pushing off work. And in fact, procrastination is very seldomly about laziness, because as we all know, so much of procrastination takes a lot of effort and puts a lot of strain on us, right? It's stressful to procrastinate because we're actively thinking about what we're not doing. And so it can create a lot of anxiety in us, et cetera. So for those of you with really busy schedules, that doesn't necessarily translate to procrastination. So give yourself a little bit of a break there and don't beat yourself up about procrastinating. Now, it still means we have to come up with some techniques to turn in the work on time, because that's still essential. But it also means that we don't want to draw conclusions about who we are as people because we're busy and that work's been pushed off. In a similar vein, those of you who are putting off work because it stresses you out because you're not quite sure what you're doing in that work. This is where I would fall into as a procrastinator. I often put off work where I don't have a clear path forward. So if I have a paper project, if I have a report I need to turn into the university and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do, I'll put it off and put it off. And for many of us, we will use this as a tool to motivate us because we'll wait until that pressure builds to the point that we have to act. But as a lot of you really astutely pointed out in the discussion board, that method works to get the work done, but it damages our ability to put in our best work. Now, some of us are fortunate where it's not me, but some people are really fortunate that work ahead. I'm not naming names, but one of them might be in the room with us right now who likes to work ahead and then think over all of that work that they've done and really consider everything. Sort of overthink is the word people put in there, and that's a whole separate thing. But for most of us, we have this sort of process of putting off work until we have to act, and that gives us the motivation to finally move. But sort of recognizing that means that the work gets turned in hurriedly. And so let's talk a little bit about what we do then. First thing is, I want you to think of like a to-do list. So break up your tasks into smaller tasks. This one is really helpful. Let me fuss at my dog real quick. So what I like to do is take a bigger task. Say, for instance, I don't like fussing at dogs. It makes me frustrated, makes me sad. I'm going to be not an authoritarian as a parent. I can tell you that. All right. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of to-do list. And thank you for your patience with that. I know that watching an old man yell at dogs is probably not the way you wanted to spend your Saturday. So when we're thinking about these bigger tasks, what I'd like you to do is start thinking of how you can break them into smaller tasks. So what I would put into your sort of to-do list for that day is start with something simple, like read the assignment or sign into Canvas. Both of those are really helpful for making sure you stay on top of the work. So if you set up a habit of just signing into Canvas every day, that will help you turn in the work on time, or just reading the work, the assignment every day, even if you don't have any intention to work on it until the weekend. That's totally fine as well, but because it will get you familiar with the task ahead. So be thinking of the ways you can become acquainted. So instead of avoiding the task, put yourself in close proximity to it and then break it up into steps. So I also like to do, one of the steps will be a time-based goal. And this is a really important skill or tool for you all if you're a procrastinator, is set a time goal. So instead of saying, I'm going to finish this assignment today, say, I'm going to work on this assignment for 40 minutes. And so then when you start the clock, you know already that you were 40 minutes away from being able to get up and move. And that really, really helps you to make some progress because you see the light at the end of the tunnel immediately. And then you start making that steady progress. So think about time goals, set a time goal in the to-do list, this will also help folks who work ahead, because if you set a time goal, you can say, I'm only going to work on this for the next hour, and then I'm going to get up and do something different, shift gears. But set those goals in that regard. I'd also encourage you, as you're thinking about these sort of delay tactics, which are methods, right? The procrastination is a tool we often use. It's not a great tool, but it's a tool we use to motivate us. But think about the different assignments that you can do ahead of time to take that pressure off, right? The weekly writing exercises probably create the most anxiety for folks, and maybe the discussion board second, but people seem to like those ed puzzles. So think about starting with the ed puzzles and getting those turned in the first day the module opens on Wednesday, and start those up so that you have a little bit of work out of the way. The reflections are low stakes, start working on those as well. That's the kind of work that you can do, but think about the to-do list. The other thing that I've recommended to a handful of people is called a bullet journal. And a bullet journal is a really great idea. You can make them for yourself. Let me share a picture of what they kind of look like for you, because I think these are just absolutely incredible and helpful. let's see here. They sell them online, but you don't have to buy one online. Let's see here. Well, I don't have a great picture of it. Give me just a second, everybody. Hang tight. This is definitely one that I could have opened up beforehand. How many of you have heard of a bullet journal? Have either of you? No? Okay. These are just really good tools for folks who often will struggle with kind of time management, that kind of thing. But a bullet journal, basically what it means here is, let me share my screen. I'll show you what it is. So there are a lot of different ways to do it, but when you make your plans, what you do is, instead of thinking of all the different things you need to do, you prioritize sort of 3 things you need to do, or they have different ones where you can stack them. So you can think about here, these are my to-do list, and then you can break them up on the other chart in terms of what day you're going to do them. You can also set goals, and you can set top priorities. Top priorities are really great because if you are a busy person like Dimitri, who's got a new little dude in your house, you can set up and say, you know what, today I might not be able to finish everything, but I can set a goal. My number 1 goal is to finish these 2 assignments for this one class, etc. So a bullet journal is great because it's not just a to-do list, it's a prioritized to-do list. So you can stack them up to where you know exactly what you're going to do if you have an hour, what you're going to do if you have 2, and what you can do if you have 3. I really encourage people to do a little bit of work looking into this, because you can make your own, and there are a lot of tutorials on YouTube that are available to help us with this. Last thing that I would encourage you to do is find a way to make good use of the little scrap minutes in your day. So for many people, what you're going to find is you're going to want in your mind, if you have a big project, you're going to want to find a chunk of time that's big enough to do the whole project. But the reality is that for most of us as adults, those chunks of time just don't exist, right? Or if they exist, they're very sparse. And sometimes they happen when we're not really ready to start working because maybe we're exhausted and tired. Maybe we're stressed out. Maybe our mind is elsewhere. Maybe we're ready to work, but we're not in a place where we can work. We're sort of commuting or something of the sort. So what I found to be really useful is to find a reward for myself for 15 minutes of work. So what that'll do is, in those times where, say, for instance, you just finished up one class and you have 20 minutes before another class, and you think, well, I don't have enough time to get anything done. Well, you've got 15 minutes in that 20-minute window where you can do something or make some progress. Maybe you start writing your reflection and drafting it. Maybe you start writing a discussion post or response. You might not finish it, but if you look for those little 15, 20-minute blocks of time that pepper your day, that typically we would throw away as scrap hours, but you start building them up, you're going to find that you're going to stay on top of that work. Last thing that I would encourage you to do is keep just a journal of sorts of how you feel about your work. So as you're doing your work, start thinking about how you feel about it. So try 1 week where you turn every piece of work in a day early. Just see if that works, and then reflect on how you feel, and then do a week where you do your normal technique of maybe waiting till the last minute, and then see how you feel and compare the two. And that can often be really useful for us to kind of think about how we feel and use that information as motivation, because we can say, look, I did this work early, I felt good about it, and it was a lot less stressful, that kind of thing. So the reason I'm talking about this specifically is because so many people talked about procrastination as being, or time management. I think of the 17 of us, I saw it in 14 different posts. So a lot of people are really concerned about it, with a few exceptions of folks who are feeling like maybe they're spending too much time because they keep thinking about the work. And I saw that in a couple of posts, but a lot of these techniques will work for you as well. Let's take a look back over here and start working our way through the chart. Weekly writing exercise. Well, let me pause for a minute. I'm sorry. Of the 2 folks who are here, do you have any questions about the housekeeping stuff?
No.
Okay, great. If you do have questions, we can always circle back. Let's talk about these weekly writing, the weekly writing exercises. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a place where I've been working to get the video comments in for you all, but I've only got one in finished so far. So we'll take a look here. And when you get to this page here, you're going to see a rubric that kind of breaks down like this. So pay attention to that. And then also watch for those video comments that I made at the, when you log into Canvas, there's a video for each of you for that assignment, and pay specific attention there to the different ideas that I offer for improving your work. And especially think about the idea here that it's not relegated to one assignment, but make a list of different focus points. So think of the things that I'm mentioning. Obviously, this is week 1. We're already in week 5, so you're not going to incorporate that into your week 2 revision. But what you can do is start thinking of these principles. Those principles are pretty straightforward. What I talked to a lot of people about was using paragraphs as an organizational tool. So a number of people, I think maybe 5 or 6 folks, just turned in one big block of text. And so what that does then is it doesn't make use of the paragraph structure to indicate to the readers when you're switching topics or maybe exploring a different element of that. Talk to a lot of people about narrowing your topic. That's an important one. So when you're thinking about a paper topic, it's counterintuitive, but let's talk about this for a few minutes. When you're talking about a paper topic, our general sense is that we want the biggest, most important topic possible. And that's one of the things that makes sense, that we're thinking that if we came to Mercer to change the world, that's part of the slogan, right? We're changing the world one student at a time. That we think to do so, we have to come up with the biggest idea or address the biggest topic. So when we're talking about the description paper, a lot of people chose a really big topic. In fact, it's really hard for us to describe even small things. So a lot of people chose this big topic, but the best way to approach every topic is think about the smallest topic that you could talk about and fill the page length. I know that's a tough one for a lot of people to think through, but as you get into your upper degree courses, upper division degree, your degrees upper division courses, the 300s and 400 level courses, what you're going to find is that the big topics are often so general that it will be very hard for you to say anything that is actually new or unique to you. So the smaller topics are the way to go. Do you all remember, how many of you have seen the movie Men in Black? Both of you. Great. I'm hoping everybody has, because I'm about to spoil it for you, but you've had 25 years at this point. So if you've not seen it, it's on you. So in Men in Black, you've got Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith are looking for the galaxy. And they go to this one spot. I can actually pull up a picture here. They go to see this guy, Frank. Do you all remember Frank from Men in Black? The pug. And so the first time they see Frank, he's one of the best characters. Tommy Lee Jones shakes Frank because they're trying to find the galaxy. And Frank gives him the sort of the clue that breaks the case for them. And Frank says, do either of you remember what Frank says to Tommy Lee Jones that cracks the case? All right, so he says, you humans, when are you going to learn that just because something's really, really important doesn't mean that it's not also really, really small? That's the mantra I want you all to have here, that the best work you can do are small contributions to narrow. Think small, not in terms of importance, but small in terms of scope is important. So scope and significance are different. Scope is how big the topic is. Significance is how important it is. So be thinking of topics that are small in scope, because that's going to lead you to the topics that are also high in significance. And let me give you a couple examples, kind of make this concrete. I had a couple of friends who worked on Shakespeare for their dissertation. So with Shakespeare, what you have is people who have been writing about Shakespeare for years and years, hundreds of years, really, maybe 150, I don't know, but you get the idea, a long time. And to pass a dissertation, so the last step of becoming Dr. Champion or Dr. whomever is to write basically a draft of a book. And the measure of whether or not you pass is if you've made a significant contribution to the field. That's the phrase almost every university in America uses. And what that says, though, is if you're writing about Shakespeare, you have to say something that's not been said already. Well, how on earth do you do that, right? Because people have been talking about Shakespeare for at least 150 years. And the way that you do it is counterintuitive. It's not by trying to change the way we see all of Shakespeare. It's by finding some little window that we can wedge our interpretation and our argument into. So, for example, one of those friends of mine wrote her dissertation on money and women. So she went through and studied every time money was exchanged, how were women affected? That's a great topic, right? Because nobody really thought about it, but it's also very small. right? It's not every story is women and money. It's details that they're picking out that they notice there's this relationship between them. The other wrote her entire dissertation on complaining queens. So apparently in Shakespeare, the queens that are featured in the plays complain a lot. So she studied all the complaints. But again, this is about finding that narrow window that nobody's talked about and sort of finding a way in to add your voice to that conversation. And so thinking small is really useful, especially because the goal of a great paper is to add to the reader's understanding. So asking questions about something they haven't considered yet, looking for that small topic that you can dive deeply into is the way to go. The other detail, or the last piece here I want to say about these writing assignments that's super important, is be thinking of specificity. So specificity, specificity, specificity. Here's the measure. Let me pause for a minute. One of the common complaints I hear with students who are frustrated in their writing classes. So I get a lot of, writing is one of those courses, sort of like math, where very few students show up excited. Whereas when I took zoology in college, everybody was so excited because we're going to take a trip to the zoo. We're going to learn about rhinos and hippos and et cetera. So we're really excited in that class. That doesn't really happen so much in writing. And in a writing class, what I hear from people is often that they don't like writing because it's subjective, meaning they think that if they turn in a paper to a professor, they don't know how the professor will like it, which is what determines whether or not that paper earns an A or a D. So almost every time somebody says that, they have this growing feeling that it's not about the quality of the paper, it's about the recipient, it's about the professor that's assessing it and how good a mood he or she's in that day and whether or not they like the perspective the person has. But it's not really that subjective, but it feels subjective because we as writing instructors have often done a very poor job of explaining the ways that you can check your work, right? Remember when you're in math classes and you can go through and reverse work your problems to make sure that you're right. So when you finish a math problem, you can know if you're right or wrong. In writing classes, there are some techniques where you can use that are pretty similar to that. And one of those techniques, when we're talking about specificity, is to read each sentence and ask if that sentence could fit in another paper on a similar topic or not. So for example, I had students once write about representations of different career fields. So their paper topic, they were supposed to choose their career field. So if it were me, I'd write about professors, and they were supposed to find examples of fictional professors in movies and write about them. It's kind of a fun paper. It's one of my favorites to teach. And if you take my 175 and 180, you'll get to write that paper as well. So the first line in a lot of people's papers will be something like, there are many career fields depicted in pop culture. Well, that's a sentence that could go in any paper, right? It's not specific, it's too general. Now, if that helps you to start the paper writing, that's fine. That's totally good. Include that, but delete it by the final draft. But if we were to say, Robin Williams' professor character from Good Will Hunting is the standard by which all other representations of professors should be measured, right? That's a sentence that is so specific, it could only fit in a paper about fictional professors. So to kind of work this, what you do is you take that general sentence and you ask whether or not it would fit in any other paper. If the answer is yes, you need to make it more specific or delete it. Typically speaking, the best way to go is to make it more specific because most of us don't want to be hitting that delete bar on our papers very much because we're so worried about reaching page length. Does that kind of make sense, everybody? All right. Let's go take a look here. So let's recap here just to make sure that we're all on the same page. When we're working on these writing assignments, the focus areas for us moving forward, I want you to focus here specifically on making your claims more specific, making every sentence more specific, and using paragraphs to really break up each point. And then also see if you can narrow your topic even further. If you can narrow your topic even further, then do it. So 3 big focus areas: specificity, that's going to be front and center, even though it's the last one we talked about. Specificity, using paragraphs, And then the other one is the narrowing the topic, right? So narrow your topic as much as possible. Any questions about that? I know we're talking in the abstract here, so I usually like to have an example, but just for the interest of time, I don't know that we'll get to one today. Do we have questions from Ariana or Dimitri there? It's okay if you don't.
No question, but I want to say that when you when you narrow your topic sentence or your thesis statement, it helps to give you a lot of space where you can come up with more ideas and better ideas.
Yeah, I think that's really sharp, Dimitri, because it's counterintuitive, and counterintuitive meaning that it works the opposite of the way you would think it works. But to your point, narrowing your topic actually frees you to know exactly the sort of guardrails on your topic. And as long as you're in that area, it really opens up what you can talk about. What I saw a lot of, to your point too, Dimitri, I saw a lot in the initial week one writing exercise of people covering absolutely everything. So we had people who would say choose, this is going to be funny. My dog's taken a lot of medicine lately, so we're going to use this as an example here. They would use spray cheese, right? So what they would do is they'd say, I'm going to describe spray cheese. And then they would say, here's the history of spray cheese. Here's the history of aluminum cans. Here's the history of Kroger. Here's the nutrition facts or the ingredients, and they would cover absolutely everything. And they'd have lots of different ideas peppered into one. Here's my personal experience on it. And what that did is it actually meant that if they were to fill in that whole paper, it would be enormous, right? And we're dealing with what might feel to you like a longer paper in 2 pages, but it's really pretty short. And so in keeping with that, it's a good idea to narrow it so that you're open to where those ideas can go and you have those guardrails set on it to where you can go. I love that idea, Dimitri. I'm glad you shared that. But think about that too for everybody. If you've ever felt like you're not sure what to include and what not to include, having a narrow thesis can really serve you well as a different tool to kind of set that up. Ariana, any thoughts that you'd like to contribute for the good of the order? I know I'm putting you on the spot there, so it's okay if you don't have any. Okay. Did you want to share?
No, I couldn't think of anything.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm good at talking and thinking of things, so or maybe too good at it. Sometimes it hurts my focus here. You all can probably see that focus is not my strong suit either, so it's an important one for us to kind of think through. Let's talk about paper titles. Paper titles, this was one of the focus areas or one of the objectives for this week. Again, if you're ever wondering why we're working on something, notice here that we've got the objectives, so always revisit this. And one of you all actually did a really good job of paying attention to this, and you'll know who you are. I don't want to call you out, but sent me an email and said, hey, the quiz here reflects some of the themes from last week. And I said, yeah, that's great. The idea here is that sometimes we'll have some repeat, but generally speaking, we want to talk a little bit here. In this session, we'll be keeping the focus on what we've been sort of working through in the objectives. But if you see some repeat, know that that should be a signal to you that this is something really important moving forward. So just know that that's kind of the case there. What we're going to do with this is I'm going to take us over here in just a minute. We're going to head over to the Mercer Library, and we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of titles and what we're doing with titles. Because I think a lot of times what happens with a title is it's not given much thought. And that's okay, because they're so small, right? People think, well, it's like 4 or 5 words. How much can it really matter? The truth is, it matters a lot. And it's kind of that Men in Black mentality too, that just because it's small doesn't mean it's not also really, really important. So what we're going to do is let me share the screen here and let's talk. We're going to look up a couple of titles and we're going to kind of break them apart and take a look at how they put them together for published articles. So when we go here to the Mercer Library, the first thing that I want to tell you is that this looks like Google, right? It looks like a common search bar. You'd see it on Google. You might see it on Yahoo if you're still living in the 2010s, or you might see it on Bing if you're at your grandparents' house. But this is not the same search engine. What this is going to do is it's going to be sort of laser focused. It's going to just pull up exactly what you search for, because in academic conversations, the language that we use is so very specific to our field that when you're putting together a search engine like this, you want people to be able to find exactly what they're looking for. So for example, if I told you all about the idea, if I talked to you all about transfer, right, you might think of this in terms of college credits, right? But in writing, transfer means the ability for students to take a skill from one class and apply it in another class. So it's a very specific way of using words. So when you start searching in the library Google search box or the library search bar, it's going to literally pull up a very different set of results for you that will only target those specific pieces of language. So it may take a couple of times to search around because Google is going to pull up anything that's close to it, right? And the other thing that you want to know here is when we go to the library webpage, this part's probably the most important. I should have started with this maybe. The library will often require you to sign in. And this is really important for you to know, because when you get into classes where you need to do research, our first move, a lot of people mention this in their discussion boards, they say that when they need ideas for where to go, they often will go to Google. And that might work well in an FDLS 130, but it will not work. That skill needs some adaptation to work moving forward. The reason is a lot of the articles that I'm going to show you are hidden behind paywalls. And so you have to go through the library to access them. You don't have to pay though. Remember when you paid tuition and it said tuition and fees? This is part of the and fees. So you've already paid for access to all of these different resources. But many students, especially students in the first and second year of college, don't start making full use of these resources until later. So I'm going to encourage you, as you start thinking of how you're going to develop your paper, go to the library, sign in. I'll show you exactly where that happens, and then kind of work forward from there, because this is going to give you a whole different set of results. They're going to be better results, generally speaking, but it's a really good one. So you have to start by searching. Let's go here, for example. You all might know that, actually, there's a good example. I've been studying nerd masculinity. Can you believe that's actually a topic? So I study the ways that nerds and manhood interact. So if you know anything about me, you know that I study manhood in America, and specifically comedy and manhood. So here, we'll start here and notice that they immediately pull up a link here for us to sign in. And then there's also a sign in tab here. So before we start clicking anything, notice that it says available online. If I click there without signing in, it'll give me a dead end. So let's go ahead and sign in. It doesn't take but a second. And there we are, we're signed in. You might have to type in your Mercer ID and email, or your Mercer ID and password, but it's the same one for your email or My Mercer. Now, when we look at these, let's take a look at take a look at these article titles here. So when we look at this one, what do you notice about it? Or do you notice any sort of common themes? Let's look at these first three. Structurally speaking, is there anything that sort of links them together or makes them similar?
I think it starts off with quotes. Well, not the first one and the third one.
First one and the third one. Let's do a quick search here, sort of scroll, because I think you're right to pick up on that we're going to see that more and more. But we do have that pretty commonly. We'll see the starting out with a quote. That's pretty common. And kind of to your point there too, Dimitri, they all have a colon here. Almost all of them have a colon. So this one doesn't, but here we have a colon right there. This one doesn't. These are books. Let me do it just by articles, because this will help us. It's more similar. We're not writing books necessarily just yet. But here we have the colon and quote, colon and quote. We've got a colon here, no colon here, but that's okay. Colon here, colon here, colon here, and the quote, right? And then again, this one I think is the same one from above. And then colon, colon, etc. So we see of the 12, 10 or whatever, we have most of them have a colon. Does that surprise anybody?
Sorry.
Go ahead, Dimitri.
It does, but also the length of the article title does too, because when I'm thinking of a title for my writing, I'm not necessarily thinking that it's supposed to be that long or it should be that long.
Oh, that's great. That's a great point. Let me ask you this then. Let's dive deeper into this. Let's kind of unpack it. What are you thinking when you start writing a title? Do you have a specific goal in mind? And then if so, how do you approach that? Because I think the way you're doing it is probably similar to 16 other people in the 17-person class.
I write at least 10 titles before I could
Do you?
choose which one.
Okay.
Yeah, write about 10 titles and then do process of elimination on which one sounds more, which one sounds better, or which one is gonna you know, give the reader a understanding of what they're about to read. What's more specific?
Great.
Because I could use specific. I'm sorry, I'm tongue twisted. I could
That's
use
okay.
that. Yeah, I could use that to give the reader an idea of what they're about to read.
Great, great. I think that's a mentality we're going to come back to quite a bit, right? Because it's really about telling the reader what they're about to read, and we're going to break down kind of what goes into these different titles so you all can recreate your own as well. Ariana, do you have an approach for your titles that you take when you're starting to write titles for your papers?
I think it's almost the same as Dimitri's. I would write my paper, read it, and then try to come up with like a one line that summarizes the entire paper and use that as my title.
Great, great. I love the idea of using this as it's spot on. It's what we should be doing, but both of you articulated points that are important for us to keep in mind here. It's about telling the reader what they're about to read and giving them a sense of what the argument's going to be. So here's what's probably missing. Part of the reason that these titles that we're seeing are longer is that not only are we showing the reader what we're studying, but we're also going to show them, we want to show them a couple of different things. We want to show them what we're studying and then where we're studying it, typically speaking. So what we get, for example, if we look at this one, Not Your Average Nerd, right? And then what they're studying, this is a quote, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But when we look after the colon, that's typically where we're going to see the most specificity. So they're going to study masculinities, privilege, and academic effort, and they're going to study it at an elite university. So this quote here, what we get, the way I like to think about this is sort of the fun title. And so the fun title is the thing, it's generally speaking, it's going to be something that's a little bit quippy. It's often a quote taken that's sort of an important quote from the article itself. So this is probably what someone said while they were at an elite university, right? Where they sit down and do this interview and they say, hey, listen, I'm not your average nerd. And so that's an important quote, probably because they're acknowledging they're a nerd, but they're also separating themselves from our contemporary understanding of nerds. So they're probably going to break apart a little bit of this, and then they're going to think about manhood and privilege and how that affects all of these things. Same thing holds true here, hegemonic masculinity in an online forum, right? So they're going to study this type of masculinity in this site. And then here, oh no, I'm a nerd, probably is a quote they found in an online forum. Now let's look at one without a quote and it'll help us here. This one doesn't have a quote, Revenge of the Nerds, colon, so still a quippy title, right? Where it's kind of, if you were to have the book title, that would be it. And then you'd have the one that tells us what we're going to read in that book title. Does that make sense when I say that? Like Revenge of the Nerds is a cool title if it doesn't have everything after it, but if it has everything after it, it takes it into nerddom. And so recidivist masculinity, identity politics, and the online culture wars. So here they're studying recidivist masculinity, identity politics, and they're studying it in the online culture wars. Does that make sense when I say that they kind of have the fun title, colon, and then the explanation of what they're actually studying within that? So when we're thinking about this, it's helpful here that you want to remember that your audience is going to decide whether or not they need to read this based on the title. So let me give you an example of where this kind of plays in, and then we'll talk a little bit about how a reader would use this information. Does that sound okay? So I was working on this paper. Do you all know who, you might not, but maybe you do. Do you know who Patton Oswalt is? Let me turn down my screen here. Do you know him, Dimitri, Patton Oswalt? Let me show you this guy here. So do you all know that I study stand-up comics? Was that something you already knew? I talk about myself a lot. I'm trying not to talk too much about myself all the time, but I know myself better than most things. So Patton Oswalt is a comedian you probably know, even if you don't know, you know him. So let me pull up here my window so you can get a sense of who this is. Patton Oswalt is this guy. He did the voice of Ratatouille, and he was a sort of a nerd character here. He's been in a lot of different things. If you've ever heard of the Golden State Killer, this woman here was his wife, and she passed away suddenly, but she was working on a research project studying the Golden State Killer, and he finished it up, and then police used this biography or sort of memoir of the Golden State Killer, and they tracked down this guy who had been on the lam for 40 some odd years and arrested him based on that work. But notice here, he's a pretty big nerd, right? Like, he's obviously visually a nerd, and he's just played the part of a nerd in a lot of different things. So the reason I bring that up is now I want to share with you all how I'm using this or what I'm studying, and then we're going to go back to those titles and decide if I should even pursue those paths, because even though they all look like they might work for my paper, most of them won't, and then some of them will. So we're going to use this as a metric, kind of a filter, and that's going to hopefully show us why it's so important to have a good title, because it's what will tell the reader whether or not they want to continue reading or not. So I'm writing about this comedian, and he plays a nerd in almost every one of his movies and TV shows. That's his character. He's the nerd. So he's been in King of Queens. He was a nerd. He was sort of a sad sack character. He was in, if you ever watch Parks and Rec, he did a filibuster. And so he stood up and told a huge story where he sort of ad-libbed it. I'd encourage you to watch it. Just look up Patton Oswalt, Parks and Rec. And he talked about how he wanted to do a big merger between like the Hercules franchise and Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. And so he had all these characters merging, and he just ad-libbed it. He made it all up, and it's pretty great. But that's a nerdy thing, right? For him to try to merge the X-Men with Lord of the Rings and et cetera. So he plays this nerd. So what I was trying to study is what happens when a comedian accepts their nerd and owns it. So what does that mean to us, right? So if you think about other comedians, you can think of what they do is often they own parts of themselves that we ourselves don't want to own about ourselves. So I don't want to call myself a nerd, but this guy gets on stage and makes his whole living calling himself a nerd. Does that make sense? So with that project in mind, let's go back here to the library, and I want to talk to you two and see if you think I should you think I would benefit from reading this article, and if so, why, and if you would skip it. So here, for example, this article is titled "Not Your Average Nerd, Masculinity's Privilege and Academic Effort at an Elite University." If you were working on my Patton Oswalt project, where I'm talking about him owning the fact that he's a nerd, would you read this article, or would you probably skip it? Keep in mind, you only have a set amount of time. You're a busy person. So anyone you choose, you have to be relatively confident it's going to be pretty good for you.
I would skip that one.
Tell me why you'd skip it, Dimitri.
Because elite university. So we're talking about Patton Oswalt. He's a comedian. I don't see how the academic effort at an elite university fits with the comedian that we're talking about.
Great.
I mean,
great.
He is not your average nerd, because he's a famous average nerd. So he's not your average nerd. He's a famous nerd, but I don't see how the academic effort at an elite university fits in with him.
That's great. That's great. It's also, to your point, it's also important here that he's a fictional, what we see is fiction, and this is about real people, right? So even though this fits really well, so this up into this comma looks perfect for us, right? It looks like something I need to read. But then here, when we think about where they're studying, that's the difference. And that's really important here, because it looks so perfect for what we're doing. And if we're just clicking on and finding the first thing that works, this would actually take us down a rabbit hole that we don't necessarily need. It's even to complicate your point even further, Patton Oswalt went to William and Mary, which is an elite university. So, but that doesn't matter because this is about real students, and we're studying a person's fictional characters or his self-presentation in a fictional context. Now, what about here? Oh no, I'm a nerd. Hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic, by the way, the best way to think about that is sort of patriarchal masculinity or white, straight, able-bodied masculinity, that not just is it that, but it also tries to push everybody to be like that, or if you're not in that category, it pushes you to the periphery. So it's about that sort of power. It's kind of a power move. That's what hegemonic means, right? Oh no, I'm a nerd. Hegemonic masculinity on an online forum. Now it gets a little more complicated here. What do you think, either of you?
I guess I'm kind of split on this one.
Okay, tell me why.
He says, "Oh no, I'm not a nerd," but he doesn't mind that he's a nerd, so I wouldn't go with it. But the hegemonic masculinity, he says in his comedy specials, he always talks about him being a nerd, which would, I guess, bring other nerds to him and tell them that it's okay to be a nerd and things like that. So would you read it because it says hegemonic, or would you not read it because it says, "Oh no, I'm not a nerd. I'm a nerd."
I'm a nerd. Yeah. So I think, well, let me ask Dimitri and then I'll tell you what I ended up doing. What do you think, Dimitri?
I agree with Ariana. I agree with what she said.
That it's a little complicated, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in this case, here's what I do is I read it. And I read it for a couple of different reasons. And it's important here that you can also stop reading an article if it ends up 3 pages in, not dealing with what you need to. But the pieces that would make me want to own or to read this is the idea here that it is about hegemonic masculinity. So I'm interested in that because he's a white, straight male comedian from a pretty wealthy family, right? And the fact that he's owning his nerd identity might be useful. So I'm not certain. The other thing that I'm interested in doing is this person here, or any article on this, they're going to have citations that will really help me. So even if that article is not good, let me show you here what I'm looking at. I'm going to go to the actual article. Let's accept and download it. Oh, it's not going to let me. Let me try a different route over. Read it online. There we go. So even though it might not seem useful to us initially, when we go over here, go to the back. See these references here? See if I can zoom in a little bit on. I think that's about as much as we can zoom in. These here will also likely have really good sources for me to follow up. So for instance, here, we've got changing masculinities, changing men. So this is slow motion, changing masculinities, changing men. We've got up here, we've got an article about the social construction of whiteness, white women, race matters, right? So thinking about how whiteness builds itself. And if he's presenting his own white masculinity as a form of nerd masculinity, that might be useful. So there are a bunch of these sources here that are all going to deal with my topic. So, but to a more specific point, to kind of bring it back home, those titles give us those parameters to tell us whether or not we should pursue it and really help us decide what not to read as well. And so it's going to, when we're writing our own titles, we want to tell the reader what we're going to talk about and where we're going to talk about it, and likely what we're going to say. So that one quote that says, "Oh no, I'm a nerd," is likely to include all of the characteristics here of self-owning, what it means to be a nerd, accepting you're a nerd, and being kind of bummed out about the fact that this is what's happening. So what I encourage each of you to do, especially as we're looking at week 6 starting up on Wednesday, be thinking of the ways that you can include a new title in your new paper writing exercise. So give us a quippy title, put a colon in it, and then add the sort of explanation of what you're going to talk about, where you're going to talk about it. kind of locate that for us, because we're dealing here with comparison and contrast. And so there are a lot of different ways that you can go about doing that. Let me show you one example that comes to mind immediately for a kind of comparison contrast. There's a book that I love. It's a professor actually at Ohio State, and she's just terrific. Her name's Linda Mizjewski. And I could pull the whole cover up here. I'll show you all what I'm doing so you're not just left in the dark there. There's my little zoom tab. There we go. All right, so this is a book that I really love. Oh, doggone it. When I do this, I can't like move my browser window around. Thought I was going to be able to do it. Here we go. All right, thanks for your patience, everybody. So this is a good example of the type of title that you could use. And so here, this is the book. It's called Pretty Funny. So she's comparing this sort of binary between pretty and funny. And she talks about women comedians and body politics. So she's talking about body politics, and she's looking at women comedians and their sort of work. So Pretty and Funny is an interesting sort of start title, because that's the binary that she's looking at. So binary, if you've worked on computers, is about ones and zeros. Binary can be just when you put two things next to each other. And in this case, what she's really interested in talking about is the idea that with women comedians, we often think of them as either being pretty or funny, but that women in America are often not understood to be able to be both, that they have to be one or the other. So it's an interesting kind of contrast. So she's looking at both sides of this sort of social understanding. For you all, whatever you're comparing, you can put in two sort of contrast, right? So you could say something like the cake wars, and then you could say funfetti versus chocolate cake, right? And so if you had the fun title is Cake Wars, because we all recognize that as a TV title, then the colon, and then you say, I'm going to study the differences and advantages of funfetti versus chocolate cake, right? So be thinking of the ways that you can start practicing this style of titling your papers, especially because, as Dimitri pointed out earlier, almost every title in the library database has this two-part title. And so making good use of that can be useful to you to sort of level up your writing game early. It also works in a lot of the ways that Dimitri described a really narrow thesis working, because now you have these sort of guardrails set from there. Any questions about the titles so far? All right, let's go back over. I think we're nearing time. Let me make sure. I hope I don't have too many. We might have to wait a little bit on source engagement here, and that's okay. Here's what I would say, though, as a challenge to you all, so we can kind of pick up on this next week. What I would encourage each of you to do as you're working on your week 6 writing exercise, or even your discussion boards, try bringing a quote from one of your peers into your discussion board, or try bringing a quote from a different source into your writing exercise. And that will allow us to start thinking of the ways that we can engage with sources and bring them into our papers. So that's sort of the challenge that I'll put out for you all. And then we'll talk about that one next week. But start thinking of, just challenge yourself to put a quote into your paper from a peer, or into your discussion post from a peer, or put a quote into your paper writing exercise. Let me give you a quick sort of helpful tip here. So when we're trying to integrate sources, okay. So here's the quote that I think everybody should try using in your responses. So you're doing these responses to your peers. Try using this structure, this sort of Mad Lib. Say, dear so-and-so. You don't have to say dear, right? You can say, Ariana, you say Dimitri, or say happy Friday, whomever. Say, I really appreciated when you said blank. And then be sure you put it in quotation marks. Here you'll notice there's just a single one, but that's because it's in a double quotation mark. So use these in your actual discussion post. But then quote them. Say, I really liked when you made this statement. And then start building off of it. So start developing why you think this was important or necessary. And what that's going to do is if you integrate this quote into, or this passage or a style of sentence like this into a discussion post, it's going to put you in a position then where you can start really responding to what people have said. And in the academic environment, that's a really critical skill, because when you start bringing in sources, especially when you get to the 300-400 level, you're doing more than just proving what you've said is right. You're now trying to engage. So it's not enough just to say somebody else said the same thing as me, we're both right, high five. Instead, what we want to do is start working toward the level where we say, so-and-so said this and I love it, let me build off of it. And let me take us the next step in the conversation, because we're no longer asking other people to tell us that what we said is good enough. We're now saying we know our ideas are good enough because we've done the work analyzing. So now we're going to build off of it and take that next step. So push yourselves to try that challenge. Let me know if you want to talk about it as you're working on it. I'm happy to set up some Zoom appointments. Let's go ahead and start wrapping things up here. Just a couple of reminders. Be looking out on the calendar for the next week. We need to, I think there might be some shifts in the schedule or the due dates based on the Thanksgiving holiday. Whatever you're doing over the holiday, just make sure you try to sign into Canvas, except for Thanksgiving, of course, but I'd encourage everybody just to sign into Canvas daily. Even if you don't do any work, just sign in daily, look at what's due for this class and others. That one practice can make a huge difference. And if you need anything from me, please do reach out to me. I've seen a couple of folks in different reflections and discussion boards say something like, I had a question, but it was late at night, so I didn't send an email to you because I didn't want to wake you up, or I have these questions, but I can't make it to the recording. Don't let that stop you. I'm here to help you no matter what. So send me emails, ask me questions, keep me posted. Let me know how I can help. I think that about covers it, everybody. Do we have any last questions for the good of the order from our two representatives today? All right, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. If you were watching this on Edpuzzle, thank you for joining, and I'll talk to you soon.